How's it going, everybody? Greg here, Gregarious Media, here with another episode of Discog Devil, where I go over the worst and best of an artist's discography, and this week I'm going over ska punk legends from Massachusetts, the Mighty Mighty Bosstones. Formed in 1983, the Mighty Mighty Bosstones started with Joe Gittleman and Dickie Barrett, both being involved in the Boston hardcore scene at that time. Gittleman being involved in, let me look at my notes, Gangrene, and Dickie Barrett being involved in Impact Unit. Both would then eventually be in the band known as the Cheapskates, in which then would reform, after breaking up temporarily, would reform as the Bosstones. Unfortunately, during that time period, there was also an a cappella band named the Bosstones, so a friend who was a bartender said, hey, name yourselves the Mighty Mighty Bosstones, so then you wouldn't have to have any legal issues. So if you're wondering where the Mighty Mighty Bosstones came from, there's that origin story. The Bosstones have gone through various label shifts. They started off on Tang in 1987, Mercury in 1993, Side One Dummy in 2002, and during their time at Mercury they made an independent vanity label which they have since continued on, Big Rig. So the Bosstones have been a very active band since they started. After the Side One Dummy record, they temporarily disbanded. They were on hiatus in 2003 or 2004, I believe, around that time period. And they all went on and did their own thing, but they reformed in 2008 and continued releasing albums ever since. Every band member has their own individual thing, so I'm only going to go over Dickie and Gittleman for this particular section. Dickie Barrett, outside of his time with the Bosstones, is the announcer for Jimmy Kimmel's live late-night show, and Joe Gittleman is a professor at Lyndon State College, or as it now is, Northern Vermont University. And I know this because he was my professor back when it was still Lyndon State College. I got into Bosstones around high school. A fellow music nerd friend of mine had a couple of their CDs, and of course the first song I heard from them was The Impression That I Get, being their big sort of standout hit at the time. I sort of got into their albums, but I never really got into them up really until college, and that isn't just because my professor just happened to be the bassist from Mighty Mighty Bosstones either, but it did give me a little bit more incentive to sort of look into their discography, and this was at the time where I started getting more into hardcore music, more hardcore punk, and more extreme forms of metal as well, and my music taste sort of expanded. Now, while I'm certainly not a ska-holic, I do enjoy various ska bands and ska hits from the time. The Bosstones, to me, really stand out still, and in fact, their debut album, The Devil's Night Out, is cited as being one of the, if not the, first ever ska-core album ever recorded. So the Bosstones, while they never really had huge mainstream success outside of their one hit, The Impression That I Get, they really are an incredibly influential band, and they are still huge in New England and play festivals pretty much consistently every year. These guys have been around for over 30 years, have released 10 studio albums. Where do they rank? In my opinion, that's what this video is about. From worst to best, this is Discog Devil, the Mighty Mighty Bosstones. Let's go! At the bottom of this list at number 10, we have the album Pay Attention. This was released as a commercial follow-up to Let's Face It, which was their big album with the big hit. This is also the only album that was released on Island Records after Mercury had merged with a branch of Universal Records, in which then Bosstones were under Island and Def Jam Recordings management from that point on. And to say the least, this album did not follow up the commercial success of Let's Face It, and there's a multitude of reasons for that, I believe. One, we could easily say that Island and Def Jam were not a great fit for Bosstones, and they would attest the same because they wanted to leave this label shortly after the album's release. They felt that the management wasn't good to them, and it was basically on mutual terms that, hey, we're not getting along, the album's not doing it as we thought it would, let's part ways. But as a fan, and this is at the bottom of the list, so you can guess what I'm about to say,
The songwriting here was not nearly as strong. This easily has some of the weakest material that Bosstones have ever written and recorded. On top of that, this is also the most quantitative album with 16 tracks, most of which ranging between 2.5 to 4 minutes, usually being within sort of that mid-tempo, trying to find that radio hit sort of sound. And yeah, this album suffered as a result. Now, the album starts off pretty strong, actually, with songs like Let Me Be and Skeleton Song, both having the ska, punk sort of sound that Bosstones are known for, and I think pretty good, not great songs, but they certainly start off the album well enough, and I certainly got into them. But shortly after that, it falls pretty flat. All Things Considered, So Sad to Say actually being, I believe, the only single that was released from here, or at least with a music video, from what I could find. This single didn't chart, and I would argue more so because the song itself is just kind of It's kind of a pretty standard ska punk tune for the time. It sort of was pretty watered down for Bosstones. This High School Dance sounds like an unfinished demo. Lyrically, it's some of the weakest lyrics in the entire catalog. It's weird because Dickie is trying to find a melody here and it just doesn't work. It sounds like he's stretching out words at points and it's really awkward. See the reason that pause and then goes into the next line. It's a really weird... She Just Happened is a little bit notable because it sounds like something that could have been a kind of poppier radio hit. It's definitely outside of Bosstones' normal territory, and I think with the right promotion, maybe it could have done okay, but it's, again, it doesn't stand out for the best reasons. It's certainly not a good Bosstones song. I'd say it's decent at best. Most of the songs in between are pretty much unmemorable for any reason, outside of the three that I am about to list for you. You have songs like Allow Them, which is the huge anthemic hard riffs and hard horn lines that we know Bosstones for. I think that's a pretty decent song. I'd say a good song. You also have Over the Eggshells, which is arguably the most hardcore that they get on this album. It's not quite ska-core, but the energy is definitely much more up there than a lot of the songs are. And then I think a completely underrated cut, a massive gem in this album, is Riot on Broad Street, where lyrically it goes over sort of the holy wars in early Boston history, and it has more of like a folk-based kind of songwriting to it. It's actually really impressive and a very standout experiment in, I think, any Bosstones song that they've done, because it definitely doesn't sound like a typical ska tune. It has flute, and it has these very weird, kind of almost country-like guitar twangs. Not really like country per se, but the guitar tone is definitely a bit more twangy and a bit more brighter than in the usual ska approach. The song itself is just a really cool experiment that I think went over a lot better than any of the other tracks did here. So Pay Attention was a failed follow-up, and we could argue that probably the label management at the time didn't really work with Bosstones well enough. But I also think that this album just didn't have a lot of strong moments, or strong enough moments, to really be up there with a Let's Face It. At number 9, we have A Jackknife to a Swan, released off Side 1 Dummy Records. This was the only record released off Side 1 Dummy. And this showed, I think, much more of a sonic similarity to Let's Face It. It has a bit more of the ska core energy, or, you know, closer to ska core than Pay Attention was by a fucking mile. And this album starts off really strong. It has great anthemic moments that I think, you know, I've heard them play some of these tracks live and it sounds fantastic, and I think still a lot of these tracks hold up. You have the single You Gotta Go, which is basically telling a lazy friend who's bumming on your house to, you know, get out and do something. The highlight of Mr. Moran, who's a drug dealer gone informant, but who's still a dealer while being an informant. And also the title track that opens up this album is very, very nice also. It's a nice 3 triple threat right out the gate, it sounds super strong. And even the song after it, Everybody's Better, is a really nice sort of mellow ska tune. The only problem I have is that the chorus toward the end kind of gets they repeat it a little bit too much, so it sort of hinders its quality a little, but it's still overall a really good song. So the first quarter of this album is a very nice return to form, and something that I think would have been more of a proper follow-up to Let's Face It than Pay Attention was. However, with that being said, there's a reason it's at near the bottom of my list, and that's because there's still some songs that aren't quite as memorable. Most of the tracks from Sugar Free to Punchline aren't really that memorable at all, with the exception of a song like You Can't Win, which is another anthemic highlight. Go Big is a decent anthem, and 7 Ways to Sunday shows Bosstones going more in an acoustic folk direction. And it's not like they haven't had harmonica on an album before. They actually had it on A Little Bit Ugly, the song that closes out Devil's Night Out, their debut. But this is pretty much the most straightforward folk-sounding song that they've ever done. This pretty much scraps ska entirely. This is sort of going off of, I think, some of the folk experimentation that they did with the song like Ride on Broad Street off Pay Attention. As a closer, it's decent, but it seems a little bit out of place just because sonically it's more like almost a country-ish tune than a ska song. So it seems a bit out of place. Not a lot to say on this album. It's good, and it definitely, I think, is more toward a similarity of Let's Face It. I think this would have been a better follow-up, but I think the songwriting, while there are definitely highlights on here, as an album, there's just not as much memorable. I really can't say there's bad songs on here as opposed to Pay Attention, but there's not as much that stands out in comparison to other projects. At number 8, we have Pinpoints and Gin Joints. This was the first album released in 7 years after their hiatus. This is also the first that's a completely independent release off their Big Rig Vanity label. During this time period, I believe Dickie went off to do, I don't remember if at this point he went off to do Jimmy Kimmel, but I know that everyone had their own little projects that was happening at the time, so they reformed in 2008 after schedules sort of came back around. For the first album that's been released in 7 years, it's a pretty damn solid album. It has a lot of catchy elements on here. I'd say this has some of the catchiest songs that they have. Songs like Graffiti Worth Reading and Na 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 Na. Also songs like You Left Right, I Wrote It, and the absolutely amazing closer track off here, A Pretty Sad Excuse, which I would argue is one of the best Bosstones songs of all time, is just immensely catchy, super memorable. There are so many good hits on here that have these really super catchy qualities. I'd say some of the catchiest stuff in the Bosstones catalog. However, the reason that it's so low on this list is primarily due to the energy level. This album does have a lot more of a mid-tempo, slightly poppier edged, not really hardcore at all. In fact, most of this album has no hardcore energy whatsoever. So it's pretty much ska punk with a little bit of alternative rock sort of flair, and that's not a bad thing, and I can understand sort of the sonic shift, because, you know, they're an older band. At this point, they've been together for over 20 years. I think this would be like their 25th anniversary. At this point, punk energy is not quite up there as it used to be. I can understand that. But, you know, some of the songs just lack punch, I think, because of it. You have songs like Too Many Stars and Wasted Summers, which have more of the distorted guitar tones, and which, while they are enjoyable, at least, I wouldn't really say I go back to those songs in particular all that often, unless I'm listening to the album from front to back. You have Death Valley Vipers, which is also decent and kind of cool because of the more swing style vibe that it has, but it still doesn't really hit me enough to return to it that often. So this album, I think just suffers from the lack of energy that was in previous albums. And like I said, again, it could be age, it could be a sonic decision of their own, and, that's fine. And like I said, there are definite highlights on here that I would argue are some of their best songs, period. Just as a collective album, it's just not one that I return to from front to back as a full listen. At number 7, we have Question the Answers. This was the album before Let's Face It, and this showed a bit more of their songwriting shifting. This shows the Bosstones going from their more ska-core roots to something a little bit more streamlined, a little bit more mainstream, something that isn't really as hardcore. You don't have a lot of the extremely fast tempos. You still have a lot of punk energy on here and some hardcore elements to it, but not nearly as much as albums prior to this one. Pretty much the songwriting approach that they had on here would be later refined on the album Let's Face It. There are some great highlights on here. You have the iconic single Hell of a Hat, which is going through some mellow ska tone moments to ska tone, switching between mellow ska moments to really high, huge, distorted guitar, and very anthemic. You have 365 Days, which is a slightly schizophrenic song in the verses, and it's pretty much as close to hardcore, I think, as they get on this entire album. Dickie is pretty much screaming his head off in the entire song, but still extremely catchy, especially once it gets into the hook. Then you also have the closing track on here, Jump Through Hoops, which I think is a pretty underrated cut. It's not, super stand out in sort of the entire Bosstones catalog, but I'd say it's a pretty good, catchy number regardless. Most of the other songs, sort of the same instance as the other albums here, is that I feel that they are good, but they don't quite hold up as strongly to the other songs off of other albums. I would just say that this album in particular isn't as essential to the overall discography. While it's certainly a transitional album between Don't Know How to Party to Let's Face It, since Don't Know How to Party had much more of the hardcore, ska-core roots to it, and Let's Face It definitely has much more of the mainstream, palpable sound. Pretty much Question the Answers was going somewhere in between there, and the execution would be sort of refined on later albums. But this one, while I certainly respect it and see a lot of highlights on here, because see a good amount of highlights on here, overall, when comparing it to other albums in the discography, I don't feel it's that strong. To close off the second half of this list, we have While We're At It, the latest release from the Bosstones. This came 7 years after The Magic of Youth, which was released in 2011. I know that the guys were extremely busy during this time period, and of course with Joe Gittleman being a professor at the college, Dickie being the announcer for Jimmy Kimmel, and I know that every other individual member, is doing their own thing, and so, sort of coming together to make this album definitely took a while. They toned down the energy of this album compared to The Magic of Youth, which showed sort of much more of a punk-style energy than Pinpoints and Gin Joints. So I'd argue that this is more along the lines of Pinpoints and Gin Joints, at least in terms of energy, but it has much more of an experimental flair to it. And while sonically it's not an angry or aggressive album, the lyrics on here are definitely much more political, I would say. Sonically, you have much more keys and organs involved, which is something that happened more with since Pinpoints and Gin Joints, but they're very, very prominent on this album. There's some swing and even some jazz elements on certain songs, and even slightly psychedelic moments, depending on the song. Not, as upfront, but there are moments that are pretty standout. And it's enough to really give their formula a nice spin on their songwriting. The singles from this album, Wonderful Day for the Race and The Constant, are pretty much sonically within the typical Bosstones wheelhouse. Wonderful Day for the Race, pretty mid-tempo, pretty anthemic, lyrically talking about, how this particular day is just a great day to acknowledge the sort of joys and successes of the human race. Slightly cheesy, slightly corny, but it works. Then you have The Constant, which is a bit more laid back, still has that anthemic feel, but not really with a punk energy. But the lyrics on here are much more talking about the working class, with the chorus talking about you're ready to walk out, but it's time to clock in, and the clock will tell you when it's your time to go. Sort of talking about the struggles of the working class families and factories shutting down and jobs being shipped, overseas. Doesn't have that punk energy, but these are definitely some of the sharpest lyrics I think that Bosstones have written in a long time. The Green Bay, Wisconsin was written as to be the ultimate ska song, or an ultimate ska song, and I think it accomplishes it on this case. The song talks about a woman who leaves her job that's pretty much been weighing her down, and she just goes off and does great things of her life, and goes to a ska festival and is super happy and shit. And hey, good on her. You also have a song like Closer to Nowhere, which is a pretty energetic ripper of a song. The sax on here, especially in the opener, is just maddening in the best way. Here We Are sounds pretty fresh for the sort of typical ska punk formula that we know Bosstones for doing. I think it's because of the touch of brighter production as well as the instrumental layering, I think, being slightly more complex. And then the closer here, after the music is over, has 3 different sort of phases. The first one coming off of this huge big band swing sort of feel with Dickie going, after the music is over, da, 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 da. In the second leg of the song, it goes into a more anthemic sort of chant-along chorus, and then the final leg, the final third, goes into the more typical ska punk sort of sound that we know them for, sort of taking the anthemic chorus from the second leg and just putting it into a more ska punk context. And it's very solid. It closes off the album very, very well. While there are some songs on here I don't think that are as strong, Divide being is less than 2 minutes, which I think if it were a bit longer, I think it would have held a little bit more memorability. Songs like The Mad Dash and Hugo's Wife I thought were decent, but were not exactly as strong. And the fact that this album is 14 tracks, which is I think the second longest track listing they've had outside of Pay Attention being 16 tracks, a lot of the songwriting on here is just really nice. It's very memorable for the most part. And even though this is, the Bosstones have their set sound, their set core formula that we all know them for, the way that they approached it on here, even with just the slightest bit of songwriting tweaks, and I think the production also helps too, being a little bit brighter and a little bit bigger, I think really help make this album stand out amongst their discography. I really enjoyed a lot of songs on here, and it'd be interesting to see if they could take this style, but also just infuse a slight bit more of a punk edge to it. I'm not saying that they have to go hardcore, but I would be really interested to see if they could go with sort of the big production style that this album had and sort of continue in this sort of field of songwriting while also throwing on just a bit more aggression. Kicking off the second half of this list at number 5, we have The Devil's Night Out, potentially being the first ever ska-core album. Or at the very least, one of the very first. Initially being polarizing upon release because at the time, ska punk was still very underground and the ska community and the hardcore community didn't exactly have a lot of crossover. But over time, this album's gained a lot more recognition, especially for the fact that ska-core at the time really wasn't a thing, but Bosstones sort of recorded one of the first. This album was loaded with heavy guitar riffs, fast tempos, a lot of really cool ska infusions, and Dickie basically just being an absolute gravelly monster on the mic. His signature voice that, while has been toned down in later albums, obviously I'd assume 1, because of age, 2, probably a personal decision because I would assume after a while, if he continued doing this, he would have lost his voice. The rebellious energy comes off right from the get-go with the title track, basically talking about the devil going out on a night in the town and basically throwing a party, and then as soon as that party's done, he burns the building down and then goes on to the next one. Heavy metal riffs kick off the song, and then the verses are just this really fast ska that is still mind-bending. Drunks and Children is a catchy as hell sing-along track, as well as Hope I Never Lose My Wallet. Hope I never lose my wallet! I think we all can relate to that. The Bartender song, I think, is a pretty funny song. Lyrically, it's about this guy who usually keeps getting kicked out of bars, and he's questioning why the bartender is so nice to him in this particular instance because he keeps getting drinks and he's still not kicked out. He's like, at this point, they would have thrown me out after like 2 or 3. Why am I still here? Do Something Crazy is a great song, and also you have A Little Bit Ugly, which is a classic. This album is pretty much a no bullshit album. It's 10 tracks, just over 25 minutes. It's straight to the point, and it's, I mean, if this truly is the first, at the very least it's one of the first, but if this is the first ska-core album that was ever recorded and released, I mean, I can see why this album is incredibly influential to the scene, and sort of how Bosstones would sort of take this initial root sound and sort of progress with it. Devil's Night Out is a great debut, and I can see sort of how the Bosstones have progressed from this to an album like While We're At It, being completely contrasting in terms of energy, but I can see how over the course of their discography, how they went from something like this to their most recent album. I just wish that more ska-core, or at least more better ska-core bands were around in this day and age. Hopefully that doesn't trigger the audience here. At number 4, we have The Magic of Youth. This album is one of their later career albums, released in 2011, but my fucking god, there are so many good tracks off here. If there was any justice in radio, in any like mainstream viral hits, I swear there would have been so many off here. From the opening track, The Daylights, to the closing track of Open and Honest, there is really no bad song on here. This is a really fresh take on ska punk, and maybe that's because the production is a little bit sweeter on the ear. It's not as hardcore, but the energy is definitely here. Something that I kind of was missing from Pinpoints and Gin Joints. On here, oh, it rips. Like a Shotgun has a super nice catchy guitar riff, super great chorus. They Will Need Music is one of the absolute best Bosstones songs, and I swear to whatever fucking god exists or does not exist, why was this not a huge hit? The Package Tour Petition is a super rocking song. The title track is uplifting and pop, but in the best of ways. And The Upper Hand is also a catchy as hell song. Really, every song off here has a very catchy element. Maybe not as strong as others, but there's really no bad song. I'd say all the songs on here are good, at the very least. But this album has so many late career highlights, I am honestly shocked. Although, at the same time, I'm not, because ska, obviously, at this point, not really super popular. Even No Doubt tried coming back, and it came off as a weird Gwen Stefani reunion project thing instead of a real No Doubt thing. But that's a different video entirely. But I think that this album truly has some of the Bosstones' best work. And I'm really glad that this was released. As if there was anything holding up this release. For the bronze, at number 3, we have the commercial success, Let's Face It. Known for the smash single, The Impression That I Get, and rightfully so, it was a big hit, that actually was almost never released, because when the Bosstones were in these sessions, They didn't think the song was nearly as strong, and I don't remember exactly how it was released. But essentially, yeah, very, very glad it was released. The structure of this album shows the first half being much more ska-oriented. It's not really as hardcore. There's not as much guitar distortion here. More of the punk, even slightly hardcore energy comes toward the later half of the album. But the first half has these really catchy ska punk songs, Noise Brigade, kicking off with these bright organ and guitar chops, extremely solid bass line, and you have Rascal King, Royal Oil, classics that still to this day are played live. Toward the second half of the album is where some of the more hardcore energy kicks in, not per se that it's ska core, but like I said, this album is much more of a refinement of Question the Answers, and it's much more streamlined. But the punk energy is definitely, I think, as hard as it could possibly get without going into the ska core territory. With songs like Numbered Days, Break So Easily, Never Mind Me, Desensitized, and 128. And just are rippers that remain catchy. Why am I so bad at describing albums that I enjoy so much? I think the best part about this album is the fact that it takes the essentials of their core sound, while not being ska core, but translates it well into this more mainstream medium. And it just comes out with some of their most memorable material for all the best reasons. On top of the fact that the impression that I get was an incredible single, there's just a lot of great songs on here in general that I think just got really overlooked. And which I understand that, ska in that time period in the 90s, there was definitely a lot of hits, but it was unfortunately one of those genre trends that just didn't quite stick as much. But if we're talking about, some of the best albums in the ska punk genre, especially for the 90s, this is easily up there. At number 2 for the silver, we have More Noise and Other Disturbances, the follow-up to Devil's Night Out. Essentially, what I can say about the sonic direction of this album is just a more refined Devil's Night Out. Awfully Quiet is awfully catchy. Where'd You Go is just as catchy, if not even more so. And I think if this album had the sort of mainstream attention, there are some songs that I think could have been really big off here. Dr. D, which is a classic ska core song that's always played still to this day at Bosstones shows. You have the song What's at Stake, which is a cover from a Tang label bandmate at the time, Slapshot, which is just heavy as well as funky as fuck. Guns of the Young is a take on gun control at that time, or not so much control, but sort of the way that the media and entertainment have sort of portrayed guns essentially being as the sort of cool thing that Dickie was worried that, would have a really bad impression on the youth, especially with, I think, there had to have been some school shootings at that time. Bad and Plaid comes off as kind of a cool theme song for the Bosstones. And They Came to Boston is a really cool closer, basically ratting on Taurus and telling them to get the fuck out. There's not a lot I can say about this album. It's really just a great refinement of what the debut was, with just a lot of great songs. And speaking of refinement, for the gold, the follow-up to More Noise and Other Disturbances, Don't Know How to Party. Yeah, this is essentially just refining that even more. But this album, I think, pretty much breaks the limits of sort of where ska core could go, which is why I can kind of see why they went in a more streamlined direction with Question the Answers. But this album, holy shit. Gittleman actually gave me an original vinyl pressing of this as a graduation present. And I wish I had it here in my apartment to show you, but when I moved in, I still don't have a place to put my record player yet, but I'll do a vinyl video eventually. Yeah, I love every single fucking song off here. This album's fucking great. The opener of Our Only Weapon sets the tone off right with these absolutely ripping heavy guitars and solid horn layers. The title track is super infectious, and the single Someday I Suppose, which is another Bosstones classic, is just, oof. A Man Without, I feel, needs to be a longer track, clocking in, I think, just around 2.5 minutes. But it is some of the most aggressive vocals I've ever heard Dickie perform. You have the song Tin Soldiers, which is hyper aggressive, hyper catchy. You have Almost Anything Goes, which I would argue, while having a bit of songwriting similarity to Someday I Suppose, I think could have been a really big hit if promoted properly. I'm not sure if it would have gotten as big as, say, The Impression That I Get, but for ska punk, this easily, I wish they played this live. What Was Over is one of the more mellow moments, but it's still really infectious without losing the momentum of the album. And 737 Shoe Glue is an incredible ska punk closer. I think this is the quintessential Bosstones record, and I'd argue that, honestly, the top 3 here are quintessential records. Number 6 to number 1 on this list, I would highly recommend you check out immediately. But this album, I think, just took their ska-core sound to the absolute limits in both aggression and melody. And I am just so happy an album like this exists. They stayed in their lane. They just tweaked their formula every album enough so that it would at least stand out compared to the next one, or compared to the one before. With a lot of my previous episodes of this series, I've gone over bands and artists that have genre hopped or have fused genres and have always experimented in various ways with their albums, but every one had a very distinctly different sound. Whereas Bosstones, you can always tell it's a Bosstones record because they always have that ska punk signature flair in their songwriting. Now, again, certain tweaks in the songwriting, certain tweaks in production, Bosstones just stayed in their lane, and they've been doing them for over 30 years. And I saw them live earlier this year at the Crankin' and Skanking Fest, and they were still top-notch. While I do enjoy their older material more so than the newer stuff, there's still plenty to enjoy from every album, with, the exception of Pay Attention. There's plenty about most Bosstones albums to enjoy. I just happen to find that Don't Know How to Party is just my favorite. So that will do it for this episode of Discog Devil. Thank you all for watching. Let me know what your favorite Bosstones albums are from worst to best in the comments below. I'll also have a playlist going over the key 3 tracks from each album on Spotify. You can find that in the description as well as a playlist to this series of Discog Devil, where I've been going over artists who have had independent success, whether or not they've been signed to a label, whatever. And also my social medias are down there. Like, comment, subscribe, hit the bell, YouTube shtick, you know what it is. And stay tuned for the next few episodes. I'm going to try to get at least 10 of these out here before the end of the year. So stay tuned. I am Greg of Gregarious Media. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next episode. Goodbye.